Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for the June installment of the Sunday Conversation series as we zoom through 40 years of ME/CFS with MassME. A little housekeeping before we start today's program. Please take a moment to make sure that you're muted on the Zoom, as that will help our presenters a lot. Please use the chat function in Zoom for any comments or questions. In fact, please use the chat right now to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. We will try to answer any questions today during the program, but we will not have time for a question and answer session after the presentation today. If we don't get to your question in the chat, I'm sorry. I will let you know at the end of the presentation how you can get in touch with us later. We will be posting a recording of this presentation and we'll notify you when we do so. So if you need to leave before the end, you can always tune in and watch it later. And a quick note, we do know it's Father's Day. We wanted to keep the regular cadence of the Sunday Conversations series, but I want to give a shout out right now to all those fathers out there with ME/CFS or related illnesses. We see you, you are amazing. And also to the fathers caring for and supporting children, spouses, friends, or others. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Okay, let's get right into it. My name is Susan Buckley. It is my great privilege to be co-president of the Massachusetts ME/CFS and FM Association, or MassME, this year. I've been involved with the organization since 2015, shortly after my son was diagnosed with ME, and the information, community, and support I have found here has been as life-changing as that diagnosis. The more involved I've become with MassME, the more aware I am of the remarkable history of the organization and the amazing people who founded and kept it running for decades. MassME has been a leading voice in advocating for knowledge, research, and clinical care. We have sponsored support groups, organized public awareness events and healthcare practitioner education, contributed funding and expertise to research, and provided doctor referrals, disability counseling, and one-on-one patient support. We are the oldest state-level organization for this illness in the US, with a national stature and reputation and an international following. So the next slide, please. This year, we are launching a 2-year campaign, MassME at 40. This campaign will celebrate our history and our community, continue to raise awareness of ME/CFS and other post-infectious chronic illnesses at this crucial post-pandemic moment for healthcare provision, and we hope grow our membership so we can move into our 5th decade stronger than ever. The MassME at 40 campaign will celebrate and acknowledge the contributions of many volunteers over the decades and provide renewed momentum for our trajectory into our 5th decade. We invite all of you to participate in this campaign, and you'll be hearing from us about opportunities to do so. We are together, MassME, and we are stronger together, as we always have been. So next slide. Today's presentation will cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. We have 4 people from our organization presenting a history of the illness and of MassME's activities. Afterwards, we'll hear from longtime MassME member Ken Casanova, interviewed by someone from a younger generation, Jehan. So buckle up, everyone. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Charmian, who's going to cover the 1st decade.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charmian Proskauer. I'm a past president of MassME, now a volunteer and a member of the Sunday Conversations team. I started volunteering with MassME in 2008. I'm going to talk about the 1st decade of our association's history, from 1983, when we were a network of patient support groups, to 1982, and also what was going on in the world of ME/CFS during those years. Let me just see. But before we begin, we have a fun little quiz question for you. You may choose one or more answers. Which of these terms has been used for ME/CFS? So you can choose one or more answers and go ahead and answer the question. But be sure and scroll down to make sure you can see all the choices. Okay. It looks like we have a lot of answers here, and you could choose one or more. But so actually, whichever answer you chose is correct. All of these terms have been used for ME/CFS in the past. Now let me go back. So this slide is a little timeline of some of the most important events during this decade, things that were going on in the world of ME/CFS. Although there have been many outbreaks and reports of an ME-like disease in various parts of the world during the 1900s and even before, which you may already know about, I'm going to start our story at the time when many of the people who are well known in the ME community in the United States today first became involved. In 1984, there was a well-publicized outbreak of a serious but mysterious disease in the Lake Tahoe area of Nevada. By 1985, the CDC had been called in, and Epstein-Barr virus had been found at elevated levels in many of these patients, resulting in 2 papers in 1985, one by Jones and one by Strauss, documenting the association of chronic Epstein-Barr virus, or CEBV, with these persistent unexplained illnesses. It's worth stating here that despite the high incidence of EBV in the patients studied, not all the patients showed this, which was noted by some researchers, including Dr. Anthony Komaroff from Boston. This was a clear signal that EBV was not the cause of the disease, and that in addition to the EBV reactivation, other triggers could be responsible for the disease symptoms. Next slide. In 1986, Dr. Melvin Ramsey in the UK published a case definition and diagnostic criteria for myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, as the disease was known in the UK. And in the US, Dr. Gary Holmes of the CDC led a task force which published another set of criteria in 1988, also renaming the condition the chronic fatigue syndrome, recognizing that Epstein-Barr virus was not the likely cause and possibly attempting to help quiet the panic the disease was causing in the tourist business around Lake Tahoe. The Holmes criteria were used in the US for the next several years, but the name chronic fatigue syndrome persisted for decades, and psychiatrists had already begun proposing psychiatric causes for the illness. In 1987, at the first conference on the disease in Portland, Oregon, a more medically accurate name, chronic fatigue and immune dysfunction syndrome, was suggested by Dr. Seymour Grufferman, who recognized that the name chronic fatigue syndrome carried a negative judgment. The new name was adopted by many patient groups, including our own, but not by the US medical establishment. One notable group that used the new name was the CFS Association of America, which formed in 1987 and later transformed itself into the Solve CFS initiative, which is now a very powerful and important organization, Solve ME. Next slide. Finally, in 1992, the first primer for clinicians was published, which summarized the current state of knowledge about the disease. It was based on the Holmes criteria and included the pathophysiology, symptoms, and guidelines for treatment and management. This filled a gap for practicing clinicians, and thousands of copies were sent out by mail in response to requests from around the world. Next slide. One important book from this early decade that hasn't gotten enough recognition, in my opinion, that is the large volume published in 1992 by the Nightingale Research Foundation in Canada, led by Dr. Byron Hyde. This book provides a roadmap to ME, CFS, PVFS, CFIDS, aka the disease with 1,000 names, with research papers from many parts of the world covering all aspects of the disease, including those presented at the 1990 Cambridge Easter Symposium on ME/CFS, held at Cambridge University in England. This was the first international conference that brought together researchers from around the world, and there were sessions on most of the topics that would be covered in a similar conference today. If you want to buy this book, it will cost you $100, but you can download a PDF for free. Warning, it's 750 pages and 750 megabytes. So the takeaway here is that most of the key ideas about ME/CFS, including the basic scientific knowledge, the treatment management suggestions, and the social impacts, such as trivialization, stigma, and minimal research funding, were well established by the end of 1992. Most of what has occurred in the subsequent decades has been putting more detail around these basic concepts. Next slide. Today's association began with one support group in 1983, which quickly grew to a network of as many as 36 groups across several states. Two local physicians, Dr. Al DiMaria of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and Dr. Anthony Komaroff of Harvard, were loyal and trusted friends to our association from the very beginning. Together, they gave medical and scientific credibility to the association. By 1985, the broad range of services that we continue providing today had been established using the technology that was available at the time. We had in-person support groups meeting in homes and libraries. A lending library of books was delivered to patients by mail and by car. A telephone information line was staffed by patient volunteers. These same services continue today, but they are using very different technology. Finally, in 1985, a formal organization, the Massachusetts CEBV Association, was established, and it became a nonprofit 501c3 in 1988. Now we're going to fly through some historical artifacts. Next slide. Here's an example of a fact sheet that was published by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. Next slide. Starting in 1987, a newsletter, the MassCEBV Update, later just called the Update, was mailed out to disseminate information to all members and support group leaders. Note the list of services offered and that Dr. Komaroff was giving one of the educational talks. Next slide. Here's an example of a brochure for the public, which was also published around this time. 1991 was a big year. The association changed its name to Massachusetts CFS Association, and we held on to the name CFS until 2018. Next slide. We published our first disability handbook, which has been revised several times since and is still very well regarded. Next slide. Mass CFS was always involved in advocacy. We supported advocacy efforts that were initiated by other organizations, such as a request to include specific language in the federal appropriations bill and to urge more research funding. And that letter is on the left side of the screen. Mass CFS was also a founding member of the advocacy coalition CACTUS, which stands for CFS Action Campaign for the US, and that's on the right side of the screen. Next slide. Here we are at the 1992 primer again, and now I can reveal that the first primer for physicians and allied health professionals was written by health professionals who were members of our association, and it was funded by the Massachusetts CFS Association. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Phil Chernin.
Thank you, Charmian. I'm Phil Chernin. I serve as co-president of the association with Susan Buckley, who's our moderator. I joined the organization in 1987, so I've been kicking around for quite some time. It's been my honor over the last 4 or 5 years to serve on the board in various roles. And I am thrilled to be able to talk about some of our history during this so-called second decade. While Charmian was sort of ended on a pretty high note, I'm going to have to bring us down a notch, unfortunately, when we talk about this decade. I would sum this decade up as one in which national politics got really ugly. Most patient organizations either folded, actually most of them folded, or stayed around to fight the ugliness. The association, however, stayed focused on direct service to patients and their families, which the good news is has always been and will continue to be our defining characteristic. Here's a timeline of some of the
Yeah, Phil called me, woke me up.
Here's a timeline of some of the important events during this decade. I'll talk about the first two milestones, the two criteria together. Next slide. Charmian talked about a couple of the early case definitions of the illness. Both of those were revisited during this decade. Ramsay became the so-called London criteria, according to the National Task Force in Great Britain. And Holmes was replaced by Fukuda. While this very busy illustration you're looking at was made recently, it illustrates the evolution of a problem that started in the prior decade and was greatly exacerbated in this one. Confusion as to whether ME and CFS are the same or different, and how to diagnose either. Generally speaking, the London criteria sound a lot like commonly accepted criteria of today: exercise-induced fatigue, impairment of short-term memory coupled with other neurological symptoms. And the term myalgic encephalitis was specifically used. Fukuda, on the other hand, only requires 6 or more months of fatigue, a significant reduction in activities, and 4 out of 8 symptoms. And those symptoms can be as common as headache or sore throat. The criteria did not mention ME, only CFS. Unfortunately, the Fukuda criteria were adopted by the CDC, and sadly, those criteria were so broad that any number of other illnesses, including psychiatric illnesses, could be diagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome. By the middle of this decade, the illness that we call CFIDS was being torn apart in a tug of war between egos, money, political corruption, and bad science. To the casual observer, it would seem that CFIDS was just a yuppie flu, a bothersome news story that wouldn't go away. Fortunately, journalist Hillary Johnson set the record straight in her extraordinary book, Osler's Web. This meticulously researched book delivered a public indictment of the medical bureaucracy's selfish indifference to the suffering of millions of Americans with CFIDS, and the government, especially the CDC's, ineptitude and at times vindictive handling of what knowledgeable researchers believed at the time to be an epidemic of one or more mystery viruses. Following the publication of Osler's Web, as if right on cue, the Washington Post broke a story on the misuse of CFIDS funds by CDC. Slide, please. The Post reported the CDC since 1989 secretly diverted money that Congress had appropriated for research into chronic fatigue syndrome. The bottom line of this report and dozens of other news outlet reports and news reports was that roughly $13 million that was appropriated by Congress for CFS research literally went missing, unaccounted for at the CDC. While no criminal charges were ever brought, the incident was a major embarrassment to the CDC. Fortunately for us, while this craziness was going on, we grew substantially. We rented office space in Waltham, where volunteers would take phone calls on our information line that Charmian had talked about. Patients could ask questions, just talk about the illness with other volunteers, or obtain referrals. At one point, we had 14 volunteers managing the hotline. VH tapes and other resources were made available to members through the US mail through our library at the Waltham location. One of our most requested items was the disability handbook that Charmian referred to earlier, and that is almost entirely the work of Ken Casanova, who you'll hear from later, who's my personal hero. The handbook underwent substantial update, and many copies were made. Now it's only available in digital form as a download from our website. The library, by the way, does still exist. We don't move things around by car and US mail anymore, but it does exist. And at some point during this MassME at 40 campaign, we're going to figure out a way to make all of these resources available online. And there are a lot of them. Primary vehicle for our patient education during this time was the update, which was professionally produced. We had about 1,000 subscribers at this point, and we had at one point up to 15 volunteers who were typesetting, writing articles, and producing this periodical, which generally ran 20 to 40 pages. During this period, as Charmian mentioned, we had a whole bunch of support groups. They were meeting throughout the state. They grew, and they were a lifeline to patients. In addition to all the typical activities of a support group, participants would discuss and recommend physicians and other healthcare providers. And we had a bunch of good ones in Boston at the time. Providers' names were collected from all the groups after each meeting and organized into a card file so that volunteers could provide patient referrals. Eventually, that card file was computerized, and it's still in use today with new provider names entered and outdated names deleted. In 1987, we launched the association's first website. We began receiving doctor recommendations through web forms, such as the one shown on the bottom right of the screen. In fact, that is the one that we currently use. In 98, the association co-hosted a major conference in Boston, along with what was then the nascent American Association for CFS. The American Association for CFS eventually morphed into what is now the International Association for CFS-ME, which now hosts a major international conference every couple of years and publishes a very well-regarded medical journal. Throughout the decade, the association hosted lectures by most of the prominent doctors and researchers in the field, Doctors Cheney, Peterson, Lapp, Bell, Byron Hyde, and locally, Doctors Komaroff, DiMaria, and Goldenberg. These in-person lectures, which were videotaped and added to our library, and we still have on VHS tape, we hope to digitize, included panel presentations by recovering patients, information on caretaking the illness, and other things which we now primarily do through our Sunday Conversation series. We were incredibly fortunate to have Doctors Komaroff and DiMaria actively involved in the association. Largely due to their involvement, we developed the outstanding reputation that we still enjoy today as being a source for current, reliable information about the disease. Now it's much easier to get current, reliable information on the web. Back then, it was really difficult. For every one piece of factual, useful information, there were probably 15 pieces of nonsense. And we developed a very strong reputation as the go-to place for information. Toward the end of the decade, in recognition of the prevalent comorbidity between CFIDs and fibromyalgia, we officially changed our name to the Massachusetts Chronic Fatigue, Immune Dysfunction, and FM Association. And with that, I will turn it over to Hayla.
Hayla, your video's off.
Yeah, just started it. Hello, everyone. I'm Hayla Sluss. I'm a current board member of the MassME Association and a member of the Sunday Conversations team. I'm going to talk about the third decade of our association's history from 2003 to 2013. If Phil said things went down, I think after his talk, it looked like there was a lot of activities, but before I start that, there's going to be another quiz, and you may choose more than one answer on here. So the question is, which of the following agencies has been a target of MassME, CFS, and FM advocacy? Right, so actually people did well. That is the correct answer is all of the above. That's wonderful. So if I could have the first slide. So this is this timeline highlights some of the important events during this decade, world events related to ME/CFS. As indicated on the other slides, this does not cover all events in the US and internationally. In 2003, a new and much more accurate diagnostic criteria and case definition was developed, the 2003 Canadian ME/CFS criteria, also known as the CCC. This work was spearheaded by the National ME and FM Action Network of Canada, which was a patient group, advocacy group. What happened was they surveyed physicians and asked what would be most helpful assisting them with care of ME/CFS patients. The physicians agreed that a clinical definition and clinical and treatment protocols would be most important. Then this action network approached two physicians, Dr. Carruthers and Dr. Jane, who helped treat patients. And they involved the government in helping to have a panel to come up with a more robust criteria, which is now the CCC. During the same year in 2003, the Department of Health and Human Services made a advisory group called the CFSAC, and it was established from a previous group called the CFSCC, which is the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Coordinating Committee. Can I have the next slide, please? The CFSAC goal was to act as a liaison to the Department of Health and Human Services and to offer recommendations on CFS. It included public input from patients and interagency coordination, including the FDA, CDC, SSA, and the NIH. For over 15 years, the committee made important recommendations, including removal of an ME/CFS toolkit from the CDC website that was incorrect, as well as to increase funding for ME/CFS and other important action items. Some of the recommendations were eventually followed, such as removal of the toolkit. Others were listed, unfortunately, as completed, but not actually completed. This committee, unfortunately, was disbanded unexpectedly in 2018, which led to more frustration. Members of our association attended the meeting and served as advocates. I'll put a link in the chat to a write-up of one of these meetings when I'm done with this talk. If you could go, yeah. So back to the timeline. In 2003, the Workwell Foundation in California published a seminal paper that examined cardiopulmonary function in a 2-day test, known better as the CPET test. This exam became pivotal for the work with disability. It captured PEM, or PEM, post-exertional malaise, and definitely showed dysfunctional response to exercise in ME/CFS patients. Research activity was taking off in these years, firmly demonstrating that ME/CFS had a pathological basis. Several of these works were presented in the 2006 Invest in Me meeting in the UK and the 2007 IACFS, as Phil mentioned, international meetings. In 2011, the ICC criteria was published, which was an extension of the CCC, which defined ME as a standalone disease. Importantly, both these criteria, the CCC and the ICC, captured more of the variation or subtypes of the patients. Next slide. CCC and ICC both required PEM for CCC and PENI or post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion for ICC. Also, there was a recognition that these post-exertional malaise can happen hours or even days after overexertion, and that this PEM or PENI could be sudden and debilitating. The takeaway for this decade was recognition of the limitations of the previous criteria, as Phil had mentioned, and creation of new ones. The involvement of the DHS at this time and interagency offices on working on defining the research direction and needs of patients with ME/CFS provided hope there would be changes. Next slide, please. The association was marked by struggles in the 2000s. As Phil mentioned, several of the support and patient groups were closing. Ours was not the only CFS and FM group in such circumstances. Indeed, there were many, as there were common external factors, including the dismissive treatment from the government and physicians, the sense that there had been little progress on the research investment, and the drifting away of members as information became available on the internet, with thus less reliance on local organizations and support groups. In the spring of 2003, the association eliminated services, including the update, due to financial difficulties. With interest in the internet for obtaining information, the primary focus of the association was on updating the old 97 website with the essential help of new webmasters. The website was the primary vehicle for providing support and information services to people, including support group information, disability counseling, illness news, and general information. Additionally, a discussion forum and a news service was also developed. During the summer of 2003, a transition committee was set up to put the basics of the organization on a firmer footing. Next. However, even with limited funds and volunteers, the association continued to provide services such as support group network and monthly mailings, disability advice, and physician referrals. Ken continued to update the disability handbook. An example of advocacy was attending. The association was represented at the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Conference in 2005 to provide educational materials on ME/CFS. In 2005, another major update of the website was done again. The website was expanded to include content on the primary illness categories, research, coping, and treatments. There were at least 200 website users in 2005. That was a big number back then. A new email service was started, which provided periodic news updates and interactive support to patients. In 2005, a decision was also made to let members know of the difficulty of the association and ask for them to reconnect. A letter was sent out to former members along with a one-page flyer about association programs to be put in libraries and doctors' offices. Also, a press release for people to give to local media. Since there were limited volunteers, the association also started working with the Connecticut CFS Association. The times from 2005 were truly the lean years. By 2006, the participation of volunteers fell even more. There was only one board meeting that year, and the association was down to a bare backbone of the board and 3 volunteers. I think one of these volunteers, Ken, who has been throughout, was definitely, this was a labor of love to keep the association healthy and going. These 3 volunteers did all the Herculean task of responding to patients' requests for physician referrals. It was the struggle by these volunteers to keep the bare minimal association work going. In 2007, a board meeting was held to see if the association was viable. Some questions were asked. Could the association continue? And in what form? Would it be better for MassME to join with Vermont and Connecticut? There was discussion of limited funds running out soon. But the association agreed it was still needed for the patients, for ME/CFS patients to have a Massachusetts CFS and FM association. Excuse me. Ironically, concurrent with this low ebb mark, the 2 international research meetings demonstrated that there was many scientific breakthroughs going on at this time. This generated considerable enthusiasm of the attendees, both patients and physicians. It introduced a much needed note of hope. Next slide, please. No, it's there. 2008, was a year of attempting to rebuild the association and its services. The association became revitalized with new board members and additional volunteers to help current ones. Dr. Alan Gerwit, the new president, made many changes to improve the functioning of the association. A new committee was formed to establish an updated and comprehensive website. That committee met for almost a year, conceiving of the site, its design, and navigation. The site was based on patient illness needs and concept, and all content was organized according to various elements of the illness and patient needs. Charmian was integral to the design and completion. The number of volunteers helping the patient referral went from 3 to 12, and the association was having a turnaround and becoming more robust. In 2008, the association's name was updated to include ME to reflect the updated criteria and research. In 2010, the association resumed annual meetings, and in 2012, members began to attend the First Northeastern University Nurses Association. This effort grew into many more meetings that were attended in person, and there MassME provided educational information and a CMN course on ME, CFS, and FM that school nurses still use today. An association member was key in developing the program by the CDC for school surveillance, which was inspired by these MassME efforts. A reflection of the strengths and services provided, the association was awarded a generous $25,000 grant from Chase Bank. By 2011, the association had developed an email newsletter for quick communication with 600 individuals now. This decade demonstrates the power of patient advocacy, such as through the creation of ICC and of those of our association with the CFS AC, Mass Rehabilitation Committee, and the School Nurses Association. It also showed how rallying of patients and volunteers were able to keep MassME, CFS, and FM going and become even better. Thank you. I'll turn it over now to Helen McGunnigle for the last decade.
Thank you, Hayla, for handing it off. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen McGunnigle, and I'm a relatively new volunteer of MassME, starting last fall when I joined the Sunday Conversations team. And I'm going to cover the fourth decade, but before we begin, we're going to have one final poll question. So our last question asks, why is the 2022 edition of a specific ICD-10 code for ME/CFS G93.32 an important milestone? And again, feel free to make the selection that you think is correct. Even more people selected correctly, all of the above this time, but if you selected anything else, you're also correct. Great, so in this final decade, I'll describe the current events across the nation and developments within the association between 2013 up to the present in 2023. And during this decade, two of the nation's leading ME/CFS organizations were birthed, the Open Medicine Foundation and ME Action. In addition, the Chronic Fatigue and Immune Dysfunction Association of America restructured and changed its name to Solve ME/CFS Initiative. So it's really only in this last decade that the three big national organizations came into being. And meanwhile, our association forged ahead with new enthusiasm. So to start this decade, the IA-CFS primer was published in 2014 to reflect the past 25 years of research findings and to provide the most up-to-date recommendations for clinical practitioners, and became the first national standard for ME/CFS clinical care, of whom one of our members, Alan Gerwit, who's been mentioned previously in these decades, was instrumental in its writing. This included descriptions of the etiology and pathophysiology, as well as practical information on utilizing laboratory testing and the diagnostic criteria for clinicians who weren't educated on how to evaluate and assist patients with ME/CFS. So later, a pediatric primer was also published in a different format in 2017, both of which the covers are shown here. In 2015, the Institute of Medicine report Beyond Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Redefining an Illness, was released after a year-long study conducted by a committee composed of medical experts, and some of whom were patients or caregivers themselves. The report notably amended their diagnostic criteria to require that 1, a patient must have a significant reduction in ability from pre-illness levels, 2, experience PEM or the post-exertional malaise, and 3, have unrefreshing sleep, in addition to either cognitive impairment or an orthostatic intolerance. Overall, this was a huge development as it called for increased research on ME/CFS. It affirmed the condition as a real disabling disease and not one of psychological origin, and recommended leaving the title of chronic fatigue syndrome behind that has long been trivialized and stigmatized, and instead refer to the disease as systemic exertion intolerance disease, or SEID. In 2017, the landmark documentary Unrest debuted and heralded a wave of awareness, and shown here. If you haven't seen it yet, it was recently streaming on Netflix and can be purchased for viewing online. The documentary followed the life of patient Jennifer Bray and her journey living with ME/CFS, which enlightened a lot of the general public on the struggles of this illness. In 2018, the only federal agency devoted to CFS, the CFS Advisory Committee, as mentioned by Hayla earlier in the previous decade, dissolved after it was established in 2002 to make recommendations on ME/CFS to government agencies like the NIH, CDC, SSA, the VA, and more, but most of which were not adopted. But it was instrumental in the Institute of Medicine report that was successfully published in 2015. And as you all know, the 2020 global COVID-19 pandemic was a serious concern for those already living with ME/CFS and other vulnerable populations, and unfortunately ushered in a new patient population after many developed what we now know as long COVID or post-acute sequelae SARS-CoV-2, the acronym PASC. And with so many overlaps with the symptoms and development, there has been enormous solidarity and advocacy and awareness between the ME/CFS, the long COVID, and other post-infectious disease communities. If you go to the next slide. As shown here in this recent feature in the Boston Globe, thankfully this ignited interest and demand for scientific medical research, including the Recover Initiative, which will focus on long COVID specifically. So during this decade, the association had developed alongside all these national milestones. And to reflect the changes in ME/CFS research and scientific consensus, and to increase access to the association's information, the organization formally changed its name from the Massachusetts CFIDS, ME, and FM Association in 2018 to its current title and launched an updated website. During that time, we also conducted a series of screenings of the documentary Unrest, including one at the Massachusetts State House shown here for discussion of ME/CFS and developments in telemedicine. And this also included screenings across 17 different college campuses, one of which I was lucky to attend at Hampshire College. So we also expanded our activities, including support groups, physician referrals, disability counseling, advocacy, and fundraising to keep all this work possible. In 2021, MassME partnered with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health to present a panel discussion of invisible disabilities, including ME/CFS and other post-infectious chronic illnesses by physicians, public health officials, including Dr. DiMaria, who was shown earlier, as well as activists and patients. And if you go to the next slide, this event was a great example of the state level advocacy led by the association and the Health and Disability Program to improve the health of people with disabilities in the state of Massachusetts. In 2022, we began the Sunday Conversations programming with near monthly presentations and discussions, and excitedly hired our first paid staff member, Ellen Rosenfeld, who does so much for the organization alongside our many volunteers and board members. Throughout it all, the association has kept its services and advocacy at the forefront of developments in ME/CFS and patient needs, and updating the strategic goals of the organization to reflect this desire to increase the number of individuals who can benefit from these programs and continue to achieve specific policy outcomes. And to wrap up this decade, I'd like to shift gears and transition to the interview portion of today's program and introduce Jehan, a MassME volunteer, as well as Ken Casanova, a past president of MassME, who currently works on the patient services team. And we're very lucky to have you both today.
Hi, I am really lucky to be here. I'm Jehan. I'm from Cambridge. I've been sick for around 7 years, which is going to seem like not a lot of time in a moment. I am here to interview Ken Casanova, as you said, who's been with us since essentially the dawn of this organization and done some really incredible work, which he will probably disagree with me on. So, Ken, I know every ME patient has their own story. And we unfortunately don't have the time to hear the full version, but if you could tell us a little bit about your early experiences with ME and what it was like trying to get a diagnosis in the early 80s and what led you to join MassME.
Sure. In January of 1981, I came down with a flu-like illness. I, of course, expected to be well again in a week or so and then go back to work. After 2 weeks, I went to my PCP, who said it would take a little longer, but not to worry. I got sicker and I had to stay home. I went back to the doctor and he referred me to an immunologist who did a lot of tests which showed no abnormalities. I expect people have gone through that, not necessarily with an immunologist, but with other types of doctors. My PCP then sent me to a psychiatrist who said there was nothing wrong with me psychologically. So I didn't have anything wrong with me. I remained sick with a flu-like illness. I had to leave work. Weeks turned into months and then years. I could barely get out of the house to do shopping and to do other chores. For 7 years, I was basically housebound. I had no diagnosis. In 1988, a friend told me that he'd read about meetings of patients with my type of illness, this MassCEBV Association. I went to a meeting in Newton and heard other patients talk about my illness. Dr. Komaroff and Dr. Nelson Gantz spoke and explained that the illness was real and physical. I went to see Dr. Gantz. He reviewed my records and gave me a diagnosis. CEBV at that time. What a relief. I'm wondering how many of you have had a nightmarish experience like that. Not hopefully as long, but still many people at the start are in the dark. I then became an active member in the association, and have been working in the organization ever since. My motivation, like that of so many other patient and family volunteers, is to help other patients like myself. So that's my answer to that question.
That is a lot. You've been with this organization for an incredible amount of time and witnessed some really important changes to the understanding of this disease and our particular corner of patient advocacy. In your opinion, what were some of the most impactful of those changes?
Okay. The first and most necessary milestone was the formation of national and state patient associations in the 1990s. These organizations provided for patient education, patient services, public education, and advocacy to the federal agencies for recognition of the illness as a multi-system organic illness, as opposed to the prevailing public health and research agencies' false opinion that the illness was primarily psychological in nature.
Mhm.
At the same time, as mentioned previously, a number of pioneering researchers and clinicians began seeing patients and found that viruses were implicated with the effects on the immune, neurological, endocrine, and circulatory systems. So that building up of patient solidarity, and organization, and advocacy, and interpatient contact with education was extremely important as a basis for everything that followed. The second milestone, as mentioned, was the 2003 ME/CFS Canadian Consensus Diagnostic Criteria, which actually defined the real diagnostic features of the illness as opposed to all the previous criteria, which allowed depression to be conflated with ME/CFS. So this new definition allowed researchers to produce findings specific to the illness because this defined the illness accurately. Then the next major, just looking at what were the really important turning points. The development and publication of the 2015 IOM diagnostic criteria. While somewhat deficient as a detailed description of the illness, the criteria was a watershed in beginning to legitimize the illness as a multi-system organic illness at the CDC and some of the other federal agencies. The emphasis on post-exertional malaise in the criteria became a hallmark for identifying the illness, thereby providing physicians and patients a major diagnostic marker. The new criteria also sparked interest in the illness in a new generation of researchers, and that was important. Next, from our side, the formation of the U.S. Working Group for ME/CFS composed of national advocates, which began to authentically engage with the new, more favorable leadership at the CDC. And I might mention that new, more favorable leadership developed as a process whereby the former leadership was discredited beginning in the where the monies were misappropriated to other illnesses.
Right.
So there was a transition, but eventually by 2015, there was a better leadership at the CDC, which patients could engage with. The CDC largely dropped the psychological bias towards the illness and substantially improved its website to reflect its view of the illness as an organic in nature. A strong effort by patient groups to eliminate the CDC's former recommendation of graded exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy as effective treatments, eliminating those was successful. And lastly, and I might mention Charmian was one of the spark plugs for that US Working Group. She played a very important role. Then finally, as hopefully a turning point, which I think it will be, the identification in the past 2 years of long COVID as a post-viral infectious illness with many characteristics similar to ME/CFS. These similarities are very likely to identify many of the pathological elements and biomarkers common to both illnesses and thereby lead to effective treatments. But pressure and advocacy from patients will be necessary to ensure that this process doesn't take forever. And I think you have one or two more last
I do. Yes. And I want to thank you for applying that pressure in the past as well, because we sort of stand on the shoulders of giants here. I know the two of us come from very different age groups, and due to the progress that's been made, I have had a very different experience getting diagnosed. For me, I'd actually heard of ME before I got sick, and I had enough context to Google it and actually find a decent diagnostic criteria, which I know they say never Google your symptoms, but it did work once. So from your perspective, what are the biggest differences for patients seeking out diagnosis today versus when you were first seeking out diagnosis?
Sure. I will say one thing at the start.
Mhm.
I still do patient work quite a bit.
Mhm.
You get calls or emails from people saying, I'm sick. I really don't know what it is. It might be ME. And I've been trying to find a doctor who knows about this. And
Yeah.
it's very, very difficult. So today hearing almost often the same patients saying they're having the same serious difficulties today as they did 40 years ago.
Mhm.
30 to 40 years ago, of course, most PCPs and specialists believed that ME/CFS was a psychological stress-related illness. Again, yuppie flu, female overachievers, stressed out people, just get better, just don't think about it. Today, while this opinion still exists, it appears that more physicians, even if not knowledgeable, are starting to understand that the illness is physical. It still remains difficult for most patients to find a knowledgeable provider. There are a number of national databases for ME/CFS providers and a few treatment centers, but the best sources for referrals and regional and local support groups and websites. However, today there is readily, as you just mentioned, accessible information on diagnosis and treatment from the CDC and the US ME/CFS Clinicians Coalition that doctors can read or that patients can bring to their specialists and PCPs. And we do encourage, if a PCP or a specialist seems open to the illness, saying, I've heard of it, I think it probably exists, but I don't know much about it, then we do urge patients to take information to their doctors. Patients can keep up to date on ME/CFS developments through credible, and I always say credible, illness websites and patient organizations. Currently, there is a lull in general physician provider knowledge of the illness. However, the new interest in research into ME/CFS and post-COVID are very likely to filter down to frontline PCPs and specialists before too long. And all this will be done with, strong patient advocacy. And I think you have one more question for me.
I do. We are running out of time, unfortunately, but as briefly as you can,
Sure.
you've seen a lot in your time as an advocate, and I imagine not all of it encouraging, especially because you work with individual patients who are going through not great stuff. What is the one thing that gives you the most hope for improving lives of patients like you and I?
Well, what gives me the most hope is continued solidarity, organization, and advocacy among patients to push the federal research and public health agencies to understand the seriousness, the immediacy of what patients are going through and to respond. Patients have to learn more about the illness so that they can be educated to do advocacy. And let's see. I think bit by bit, new elements of the illness will be identified until there's an actual breakthrough. I think genuine ME/CFS researchers are more likely to receive federal research grants than they used to be. With the advent of long COVID, millions of people around the world will be demanding answers to post-infectious illness. There will be breakthroughs, and patient pressure and engagement will bring that day sooner.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the part that you've played in this organization over 40 years. And thank you everyone for coming. I will hand the reins back to Susan Buckley to close us out.
Great. Jehan and Ken, that was really, really wonderful. It's both heartening to see how far we have come in recognizing and circumscribing this illness, and heartbreaking that we still have so many difficulties in finding adequate clinical care for patients, that there are no FDA-approved treatments, and that the research funding is still grossly inadequate. So the work and the fight go on, but we do have hope that things will change. I hope you all enjoyed today's presentation. This has been a real full team press here, and I want to give a big shout out to everyone who organized and contributed, particularly Hayla, Pat, and Catherine, who collected and sorted the historical information, the entire amazing Sunday Conversations team for their know-how and support, all our presenters, and to Jehan and Ken for that great interview. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us. We'll have more information coming soon about the MassME at 40 campaign. As I said, the celebration will roll out over the next 2 years, so we'll have lots of great programming coming up. And I know that many of you attending today or watching later have information and perhaps documentation of our organization's history, or a personal testimonial of how the organization has been part of your life. And we would really, really love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out. Contact information is on the screen and in the chat here. All right. A reminder that your financial support and membership fees make the Sunday Conversations series and all the work that we do at MassME possible. If you're not a member already, please join us. You don't need to be in Massachusetts. We have members from all over the world. Financial donations are always gratefully accepted. The Sunday Conversations team is taking a well-deserved summer break, so there will be no event in July, but we will be back in August. So warm summer wishes to everyone, and we will leave you with a wonderful video of the bridges that MassME lit up in blue on May the 12th for International ME Awareness Day. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.